What I want to announce today is that the National Party is going to build this hospital, but importantly, we're going to build this hospital back to the specification that it was originally intended in terms of giving us the capacity that we need and that we will need for the future with the generations to come.
That was Christopher Luxon in July last year.
The cost of this project cannot be justified when hospitals around New Zealand are crying out for maintenance, upgrades and new facilities.
And Infrastructure Minister Chris Bishop last week saying the project had ballooned out to $3 billion, sparking this.
What do we want? No cuts! When do we want it? Now!
In the biggest protest in Dunedin for decades, an estimated 35,000 protesters filled the main street.
Just shows the depth of feeling there is in the region. In the coming weeks, we've got to make sure that Wellington knows just how peeved off the South is.
And this from a Labour MP.
The fact of the matter is that this government basically hates the South Island.
Bishop's reply:
We can't justify spending up to $3 billion here because that comes at the cost of potentially in other investments in the wider region, but also other regional hospitals in Nelson, Whangarei, Napier. That is the blunt truth.
That is untrue. Where did this figure come from?
But what is the truth? Who measures the value of our big infrastructure projects and what are they measured against?
It does frustrate me as someone that thinks about transport quite a lot, that we seem to just accept these incredibly large sums on often very poor business cases in the transport sector, and we don't ask, hey, why isn't that money being invested in another area such as, for instance, health?
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the history of the Dunedin Hospital rebuild, the numbers used to justify a radical rethink and potential downgrade, and the dazzle factor of sums with heaps of zeros after them. Soon I'll be speaking to the Spin-Off's Hayden Donnell, but first, RNZ reporter Phil Pennington. He's been looking at the state of our health infrastructure for several years now.
And it really goes back, my interest in 2019, 2020, when the Health Minister at the time, David Clark, infamous for losing his job over going biking during COVID, he ordered up the first stock take ever, if you can believe it, of the country's health infrastructure. There hadn't been one till that stage, and this came in and it was suitably shocking. So that was a stock take that was done and was delivered in 2020. How many thousands and thousands of entries across, I don't know how many buildings, 15,000 buildings or something like that. It includes boiler rooms and all of that. And there were a lot of them that were scored in the Category 5, which is the worst category, and that needed work.
Holes in the wall, asbestos and cramped operating theatres are just some of the problems laid bare in a report on the state of our hospitals. Those who work in the buildings say the rundown nature of them comes as no surprise.
And then the next thing they were going to do, of course, was then, okay, this is the picture, now we know what's happening. One reason they didn't have that was the DHBs were all separate, of course. And that gave them a suitably large shock, which sort of translated to thinking we've got about $10 billion here that we need to spend to both build and to upgrade things.
So was this part of Labour's move to amalgamate all the DHBs?
No, it was something that David Clark really got going 2019, 2020. So it proceeded for Te Ora. We don't know if that stage that was still a twinkle in his eye perhaps, but it wasn't motivated by that. It was motivated by the fact that we lacked visibility. The country didn't know what was going on with its health stock.
And by that stage we'd heard, the surgeons complaining that Middlemore Hospital was leaking onto their patients under anaesthetic and Whangarei was falling apart. So it's not like there wasn't some indication that things weren't great, right?
Oh no, Ruth Hill and I broke the story about Middlemore in 2018, and that was the sewage in the wall story and the cladding, just nonsensical level of disrepair in those buildings, which are only 20 years old.
4 large Middlemore Hospital buildings that serve tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in South Auckland are full of rot and dangerous mould. The rotten buildings include the Children's Hospital and the Manukau Super Clinic, and new documents show the decay is so bad it's in danger of breaching the walls and contaminating the air.
And that subsequently, now the reclad on that, I think, is hitting over $100 million. So that's the scale back then. And so this has just been a gathering wave, really.
So from your knowledge at that stage, what was the worst building in the country?
Oh, well, Wellington scored really badly for its services, so things like electricals and that, which you can imagine are really, really important in hospitals. So it depends what you'd take. I think the worst seismically was Galbraith was really bad at Middlemore, but that's not in a high-risk seismic zone, but it wasn't great. Some of the Nelson blocks, a couple of old buildings down there, they're in really poor shape. You had the, talk about services, you had the copper pipes problem at Wellington. And again, you can see the scale of this. They put those in 2010, something like that. Really quite new. All the hot water pipes have riddled with holes, and that project to replace those, that's over 100 mil and counting, still going on.
Blimey. So at that stage, did Dunedin not particularly stand out as a worry?
No, it didn't. It really didn't feature much in the thinking, although, of course, for people down there it would have, and they knew that they needed a new building. I mean, you're talking decades old, the infrastructure down there, and too small, and things not working very well, not fitting together very well.
Because when we say Dunedin, what we actually mean is a regional hospital for Southland too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there is the Southland Hospital in Invercargill, but that's a much smaller hospital. So unlike Dunedin, Dunedin is tertiary, so it's got some really important services that you wouldn't get in Invercargill, and Invercargill relies on Dunedin. And so that's why this is more than about Dunedin, because it's part of the South Island network. For instance, Dunedin's part of the neurosurgery network in the South Island, and these networks are a reasonably new thing, I understand. And so Christchurch needs Dunedin to function, or else Dunedin's patients go to Christchurch. And you see that happening already with oncology, because there aren't enough oncology specialists. This is more a workforce thing. Southland sends them to Dunedin, Dunedin sends them to Christchurch, Christchurch just ends up with a backlog.
So is it true that the government hates the South Island, as was said in Parliament?
Yes, and they said, I think today, that they need, someone messaged into Morning Report saying they need a political party for the South Island. I couldn't possibly comment whether they hate the South Island, but they are paying it a lesser amount of attention than the South would like.
Take me through what's happened at Dunedin. When did the prospect of a brand new hospital first emerge? Because this is not without its controversy from day one, right?
Yeah, 2015 it comes up, and they get some heads together on that, Southern Partnership Group it's called, and then 2017 they come up with a business case. I've been reporting quite a lot recently about these notorious business cases, not for Dunedin in particular, but just that business cases on public projects are letting the side down in many cases. So the first sort of thing, what should we do, is 2017, and there you get the crucial decision, because they could have gone for a new site, a greenfield site is what they call it, and I don't know what that site was, but they must have had something in mind, and that would have got them out of this problem of, in Dunedin, you must have seen the hospital down there, it's jammed in there, with the university buildings and everything. It's got is it 2 state highways or something running either side of it? It's a real jam, but they choose to go to build it there, actually on the Cadbury site, which is in that jammed up area, probably for transport reasons in the central city, rather than go for a more remote site, which would have given them a bit more room. That's 2017. And then you see it's about 1.2 to 1.4 billion back then. Remember, this is a national government, and they're saying, maybe we could build it with a public-private partnership. Labor comes in, they say, no, we don't want to do a PPP. And then you see in 2019, 2018, they decide we're going to do it in 2 phases. First, we're going to do a outpatient block, 15,000 square metres. That's the easier bit. That's the smaller bit, has less of the fancy stuff in it, and that's still due in 2026. The real problem here, though, is the inpatient block. That's the second phase. That's 2018 they decide that, and then by 2019 it's gone to 1.4 billion, and it climbs on from there.
Talk me through the business cases letting the side down. What do you mean by that?
So what we see, even just earlier this year, Treasury in its quarterly investment report telling the government, hey, business cases generally are suffering. A business case is done to say, do we need this? What are the options? Like, They should be looking at all the options, including do nothing, and then what are the cost benefits of the favoured options. Now, Treasury has had a look at this, and they sort of are the overall mogul looking at this. I mean, meant to be keeping the standards high, and they have a lot of standards and guidelines, but people don't seem to have been following. This is across roads, buildings of all kinds, civil infrastructure. It just hasn't been working very well, and you see these cost blowouts all over the place, with new court buildings that are going up by 50%, 100%, this sort of thing. Hospitals, though, are a special kettle of fish because they're very complex. These are buildings that have, if you were to take the wall of a hospital, the inside lining, the amount of services in there of pipes and wires and feeds, it's extraordinary compared to an office building. Office buildings are really simple, and they have to be really sturdy. They have to be what's called importance level 4 for the crucial bits. In other words, if there's an earthquake or a major disaster, they have to be able to keep functioning or get up to speed quickly, whereas an office block is just importance level 2. Business cases, though, to come back to, letting the side down, not enough information, often the data is poor. Okay, so this is commentary from Treasury in March, and this is talking about health and its investment planning, which includes business cases. It says here, overall data quality is poor. That's largely because some investments are missing the descriptions and commentary of what they're doing. Some of the information in them is out of date, especially on data and digital. They don't know very much what's going on. Some of the investments lack known updates to expenditure. That's just from March. We see officials telling the government this year investment decisions have become disconnected from the available revenue and market capacity, saying there's been a breakdown in the relationship between people doing the business case, the decision makers and the funders. That can't be good. And Treasury saying often they're relying on data that's inconsistent and immature. So you can see at a planning level that's not going to go very well if you like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's often a lot of criticism that governments do nothing, that infrastructure is not getting done. But we can see from the Treasury critique that these things do take years of planning and documents and finding out what's needed and all the rest of it.
Yes, I mean, there's absolutely no question that to think that nothing's been done is not the case at all. As of last year, I was looking at a briefing last year from Health. They had 110 projects on the go. These were worth $7.7 billion. 15 of the 110 were at high risk, but 60 of them were going okay. So if you look at across the board, many of them are going okay. Just last week, there was another report that came out that showed 20 of the current health projects on the go. Dunedin made up half of that, $3.2 billion, and those 20 were showing red. So if they're red, that means they're in trouble. But that's probably about 20% of projects. A lot of these projects are nowhere near the size of this. And if you look across infrastructure as a whole, health actually is surprisingly small here. I was just looking at Treasury investments earlier this year when they put up the chart for total investment planning. It was about $90 billion. 70 of that was on roads and only $2 billion of that was health. And in delivery, health was at $5 billion of investment being delivered. Well, you had education at 6, rail at 8, kāinga ora at 14, and roads at 23. So health's just one part of the mix, but it's a key part, of course, and it's a really touchy part for people, I think.
Did someone say roads? It's one of Hayden Donnell's favourite subjects. He's RNZ's Media Watch commentator and also works for The Spin-Off, where his latest article is titled The Things That Are Unaffordable and the Things That Aren't.
It's just saying that the $3 billion bill for the Dunedin Hospital that is said to be so unaffordable is, you can compare it to some of the recent bills that we've incurred or the things that have the government has actually funded in roading, and they are far larger ticket items. So you have things like at least $3 billion for the East-West link, $2 billion budgeted for the Petone to Granada motorway, which is a motorway next to another motorway. There's the $10 billion that's just a guesstimate on the Wellington Long Tunnel.
The government is considering building a mega tunnel underneath Wellington. from the terrace to Kilbirnie. Transport Minister Simeon Brown has asked the New Zealand Transport Agency to look into the tunnel's technical feasibility, cost and financing options.
And that's said to be a really attractive option by the Prime Minister, $10 billion as well, probably for something like a second harbour crossing in the Waitemata. So the things that are unaffordable in-house seem to be chump change when it comes to stuff like transport.
Do people, do you think, look at this comparison, or is that sort of below the public consciousness that, oh yes, $3 billion is a lot to build a hospital?
I think that politicians often can just bamboozle us when it comes to large numbers. Our brains are just not really equipped to deal with numbers as large as that, and maybe they just expect people to consume these figures discreetly. But of course, in this case, it's both capital spending, it's both infrastructure spending. It's just that one's in health and one's in roads, and you say, well, $3 billion is incredibly unaffordable for this hospital in one situation, and then the most marginal of roads, often going from a small place to another small place, is getting at least the same amount. And the thing is, even if you say, well, the hospital's blown out by so much, well, actually these roads blow out. As a matter of course, if you look at the benefit-cost ratios on all of them, there's something like the Kapiti Expressway, a section of it was 0.2, so that's 20 cents on the dollar we got in gains for what was invested in it. So I think a lot of people, if you really did just weigh up one bit of capital expenditure against another bit of capital expenditure, would say, well, actually, maybe a hospital that's providing life-saving care to the people of Dunedin would potentially be a more justifiable investment than this road. It's not just this government. It's many governments have underinvested in health, and we have this crumbling health system, as Phil probably has said. Yet we seem to see large expenditure in that area as totally unjustifiable compared to just funding the most marginal of roads, which we seem to think is totally justifiable.
A 4-lane highway to Northland is once again on the books as the new Minister for Regional Development pushes it back into the spotlight. The notoriously fragile Brynderwen Hills section of State Highway 1 north of Auckland has closed repeatedly this year, cutting off industry in the north.
So that Whangarei highway, I think it is 10% of all government infrastructure spending, this is an estimate from the Infrastructure Commission, for the next 25 years. And that's not just roads. that's hospitals, transport, everything. They think that will take up, and that is something that's kind of a rock solid commitment. And I guess the point of my article, it's a bit sarcastic in the spin-off, but it's just saying that what's unaffordable and what's deemed to be affordable reflects not just how much money we have, because governments can always source money. It's also about their value judgments. It's also about their politics. And it says something about where their priorities sit.
Interesting phrase, that rock-solid commitment, isn't it? Because the rebuild of Dunedin Hospital for National was also a rock-solid commitment in the election campaign. Yes,
and it's so the fact that they've gone away from it, obviously it's politically damaging. I'm not really a political commentator, but they've obviously made some sort of weighing up there of the impact for them of breaking that promise versus breaking another promise. Like, for instance, they do have the restoring interest deductibility for landlords. That's also $3 billion. And that Whangarei highway, that's maybe there are some politics involved because that's an agreement with New Zealand First.
The fast-track legislation to actually give the necessary consents for an alternative route over the Brynderwens. They want picks and shovels in the ground.
And so maybe they have these things weighing on them where they have these commitments to their coalition partners that they really can't break. And so this other commitment that they've made is the thing that is breaking. That's just me speculating there.
Do you think 35,000 marchers in Dunedin over the weekend would have had Bishop breaking out in a cold sweat?
I do wonder whether they maybe underestimated the level of anger that it would generate. So what is it, 25% of the city going out there just to protest? I wonder whether they maybe are thinking maybe their political compass was a little bit off on this one. I don't know whether it will actually mean that the pressure goes on to the extent that they actually have to change things.
Simeon Brown's very keen on using the word productivity when it comes to justification for these things. You know, getting us faster from A to B will increase productivity. But I would imagine that the people of Southland getting a hospital that actually works for them would also probably increase productivity.
Well, that's the thing. Being healthy, saving people's lives. I mean, these are things that are just morally good of themselves. But they also do have a productivity figure that ends up getting attached to them. We have something called the value of life in New Zealand that we actually give a figure to. I know it sounds very morbid, but the Ministry of Transport, or NZTA, actually does put a figure on that when it comes to road crashes. And so saving people's lives has a productivity amount attached to it, and it has actually a dollar figure attached to it, because the cost of actually giving them further medical care is actually something that is expensive. So, yeah, that's a productivity aspect to that. And I think that when it comes to transport, the productivity gains of a large motorway are often overstated, either in the public consciousness or by politicians, but not usually in business cases, because it's well known that even the biggest and best motorway will only save you a matter of minutes. Even the highest speed limit change will only just get you to the next traffic lights maybe a few seconds faster, maybe save you 40 seconds on your journey in perfect conditions. And these are not actually major productivity gains. They're not as good as what they're being sold to us as. It's a hard thing to measure, but you could possibly intimate that productivity gains from a hospital might be higher than from a road.
Hayden questions the political reliance we have on keeping our debt within a relatively arbitrary set of parameters.
It does cost a lot of money. Maybe we just have to bite the bullet on paying some money every so often. As it turns out, things cost and they don't get less expensive. As we've found out in transport and all sorts of things, in hospitals, there's a huge amount of cost escalation.
Getting back to Dunedin Hospital, though, Phil Pennington points out that every time the plans changed, and this happened after the Labour government downgraded the rebuild, there is extra money involved.
If you're going to change midstream like this, that has its own costs. They're going to incur big costs that they wouldn't have done if they kept on. It doesn't matter. They're damned if they do, if they're damned if they don't. If they try to change midstream, that's going to incur costs they wouldn't otherwise incur. These are things called variations to the contract. This project in Dunedin will already have pages and pages and pages of variations where they've changed things for various reasons about the spec, etc., etc. Some of it because of funding problems. But now you're talking about, if they are going to revise it and revise it down, you're going to talk about massive a number of variations. That affects your contract with the main contractor, CPB, who are Australian, and that's going to cost money. So you can't change track easily on this either.
As for those 35,000 Dunedin protesters, they want some real numbers.
The $3 billion figure they think is a straw man, that's been just put up there to scare people and also to make those other regional hospital builds worried, the Taurangas, the Whangarei, Taranaki, Hawke's Bay, Nelson, because they are watching this going, where's our money going to come from? And Jules Radich, the Mayor, and people of Dunedin are saying, well, hang on, that $3 billion is not supported by the commentary that we've had, and that includes things like a car park and a pathology building, and these things were already outside the scope of this. And that seems to be a fair criticism. There's also in the Ruster report, which was out in May, this is the one the ministers are hanging their hat on, it says, hey, we've got some big other reports coming up in the next 3 months, like a quantity surveys. That's going to give us a much firmer guide. Now, the ministers alluded to this when they said recent project pricing has come in several $100 million over the appropriation for Dunedin. We actually need to pin them down on that. What has come out in the subsequent 3 months since May about that pricing? That's the key information, and we actually need to go out now and get that. If you were Dunedin, I'd be arguing you can borrow. They can borrow. You know, New Zealand doesn't have high government debt on OECD standards, so. And you're saying, this is long term. This is a 50-year build for Dunedin, and not just Dunedin. This is the South Island health network that they're talking about. So borrow the money and just do it.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Phil Pennington and Hayden Donnell. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.